It's the show where Hawaii's newsmakers come to talk and to take your questions live. From the nation's capital to Honolulu Hale, from the state legislature to the fifth floor, we bring the experts to you and ask them what you want to know. Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Pelesuji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.
Happy Aloha Friday. Thanks so much for tuning in here on this last day of 2022 and our last show of the year. I'm Ryan Pelesuji, joined by Yanji Denise, and this is Spotlight Hawaii on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. Yanji, there have been a number of issues that we've tackled this year, but one of them that continues to be a concern is Red Hill.
That's right. And it's something that we will likely be talking about in 2023 for much of our conversations here on Spotlight Hawaii. Joining us this morning is David Henkin, an attorney with Earthjustice, and Wayne Tanaka, who is the executive director of the Sierra Club of Hawaii. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here this morning.
Good to be here.
Okay, nice
So,
to be here.
David, I want to start with you. You know, since the last time we spoke on this, obviously a lot has happened at Red Hill with that fire suppressant spill and, you know, just the pause in the defueling operation now said to have restarted just this week. In your estimation, how is the Navy doing on this process? And in light of what you've seen over the last few months, what's your confidence in how things are going?
My confidence is unfortunately very low. You know, since we last spoke, things haven't gotten better, they've gotten worse. So we have yet another instance in which the Navy has demonstrated its inability to operate this facility safely with about 1,300 gallons of firefighting foam, which has these forever chemicals in them that could be living in our water supply and you know, in our family's bloodstream forever, being poured out on the ground. So they have yet to release the video to the public so that we could see what happened with this spill. So, you know, really the Navy's notion of being open and transparent is not my notion or the dictionary notion of open and transparent. We really just don't know what's going on. Things just seem to be getting worse. And, you know, the latest thing that came out is the Navy wants to keep the facility open and ready for some future business that they won't even tell us what they have in mind. They don't want to render the tanks unusable for the future. And that raises a lot of concerns because there's really no trust here. And at some point, when you have a reckless driver like the Navy, you need to take away the keys to the car. And they cannot have access to these massive tanks over our water supply. Those need to be rendered completely inoperable.
Yeah, Wayne, same question for you. How do you think, you know, since we last spoke, things are going?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'd have to agree with David that, you know, we're still in harm's way. We're still in a bad place. And, you know, we're still looking at a timeline where we may have to live under existential threat for, you know, well over a year. Still yet, and this AFFF spill, these forever chemicals, that adds a whole new dimension of urgency to this crisis. You know, even from what's already been released, you know, I have very significant concerns. We don't know if they actually were able to clean up all of the contamination, and they don't have the soil testing that could verify that. And yet, you know, now we've been told that they've gone ahead and poured concrete over the areas that they've contaminated, which is, you know, very, very concerning.
Yeah, I want to focus in a little more on this latest incident with this fire suppressant and the forever chemicals. Wayne, based on some of the information that you've gathered and that has come into you know, your organization and what you guys have developed, I mean, there obviously, when you hear a term like forever chemicals, there is alarming for many of us who just know some of the basic information. I mean, how damaging is this just for the environment? What are the long-term impacts that something like this could have? And has there been any communication into when you will receive further information or reports onto the severity of this latest incident?
Yeah, so I think what folks need to understand is that these chemicals are extremely toxic. You know, thousands of times more toxic than jet fuel. You know, there's a saying that, you know, 1 teaspoon could contaminate the water supply for entire city, and that's very true with the recent EPA health advisory guidelines. And in terms of timeline, they're called forever chemicals for a reason, right? So they're going to be, anything that's in our environment is going to be there for centuries, for over 1,000 years, and that's a lot of time for these contaminants to move through the environment, percolate through the soil, accumulate in fish and other things, and so we need to be really, really, really concerned about the adequate containment of this contamination.
And David, same question for you, but maybe more on how do you think the organization that you manage and you work with will be able to get some of that information that is necessary? I mean, what are the conversations like in terms of getting a detailed description of what just happened and how to prevent this from happening again?
Well, in terms of what the conversations are like, it's like driving into a brick wall. I watched your program a couple of weeks ago. I really appreciate your having Vice Admiral Wade on here, and he spoke about getting the reports out to the public and getting the videotape out to the public as soon as he could do that, claiming that he couldn't do it because somehow it would interfere with his investigation or the investigation that's underway. I don't understand that. There can't be any national security concerns about a fuel spill video at the facility, and that should just be released so that we the people who are in harm's way can take a look and see what happened. And the Navy just does not release this information, and so we're left in the dark, which is totally unacceptable. And as Wayne mentioned, they haven't even gotten back the soil samples to make sure that their remediation effort was effective, and they paved it over. So it seems like just a literal cover-up. And when you're talking about chemicals that are so highly toxic and so dangerous, we deserve to know. And of course, the other thing is we still have 104 million gallons of fuel in the facility with a disabled firefighting system. So I don't know why they went with a firefighting system that includes these toxic chemicals, but that's now been disabled. And we still have 104 million gallons of fuel. And so the one thing I agree with the Vice Admiral about is that every day that the fuel remains in that facility is an existential threat to the people of this island. And so we need, the notion that a facility that they claimed a year ago was vital for national security and was vital to get fuel to our military. They claim it's going to take a whole another year to be able to drain the tanks and get the infrastructure up to snuff so they can do that safely. It's just you get the sense that they're just dragging their feet, and when you're dealing with a threat to our populace, that's just unacceptable.
One of the other issues that both of you have raised, and I'd love for you to talk about, when you talk about video, there also is this issue of the cameras. This has been something from day one that has been an issue. We were initially told that there was no video of the fuel spill that sort of started this whole conversation for our community. And of course, later there was a video shot on a cell phone that Honolulu Civil Beat was able to obtain and release to the public. Now we understand that the camera system throughout the facility will not be fully operational, even as they do the defueling, which is projected to be not for another year from now. Wayne, can you talk about your concerns about not having an intact video surveillance system? And, for a lot of us, it's very hard to understand. The Navy says this is national security. They can't go with a wireless system because, of course, then perhaps, nefarious people could tap into that system and somehow obtain information that could compromise our safety. But it does seem somewhat, I don't know. I'm very confused personally as to why they cannot come with an alternative if the current system doesn't work. Your thoughts on the video surveillance issue on this?
It's I'm just as confused, I think, as everyone else as to why they're saying it's going to take up to 18 months just to procure 7 security cameras. They've pointed to supply chain issues, but this isn't like trying to maintain a supply of toilet paper. This is just a handful of equipment that would play an essential role, not just in the security of this facility, which as we know, it has 104 million gallons of fuel, just perched 100 feet above our drinking water. But also, these cameras can provide an objective perspective on what's going on and what's happening and what's happened in the facility. And unfortunately, maybe thus far the video we have received hasn't been very flattering in terms of the Navy's operations, and so for them they may see it as an inconvenience. I think for us it's absolutely critical in terms of transparency and accountability.
David,
if I could just add a little bit on that, it's not as if they discovered yesterday that the cameras weren't working and hey, it's going to take us another period of time to get some cameras. As soon as the spill happened, Thanksgiving of last year, they were aware that they didn't have cameras in place, that there was not the monitoring that you would expect in a facility of this importance. And so here we are 12 months, 13 months down the pike, and now they're going to say it's going to take another 18 months. I mean, that is totally unacceptable and just is very indicative of the lack of real meaningful concern. The Navy certainly is now talking the talk when they reach out to the public and say how concerned they are about it, but actions speak louder than words. And if you felt like you had a situation that needed to be monitored, as this obviously does, you wouldn't take this long to fix it. And then the last thing is on the national security claim that somehow these cameras that need to be very secured. What is it about the facility that somehow someone who's unfriendly to the United States could find out? I mean, there's schematics in the Navy's reports that they make publicly available. It's hard to imagine, they kind of trot out national security and expect everyone to take it at face value. But why is it that you can't just have a camera that lets you know if fuel's leaking, if firefighting foam is leaking? I really don't see the national security concern there.
Something else that has drawn a lot of concern from lawmakers that we've spoken to on this program was just the overall timeline of how long this will take to defuel this facility and really ensure that everything is gone. In talking to Vice Admiral Wade, one of the things that he continued to mention was the repairs that are needed. 253, I believe, was the number of repairs that need to be happening simultaneously while the defueling is happening in order to ensure a safe removal. So one of the questions that I had and want to pose to you, we'll start off with you, David, is, with these 253 repairs that need to happen, I mean, were any of your organizations aware of some of these other issues that have now become a delay for the defueling? It's hard to believe that all of a sudden, these repairs that need to be done weren't identified earlier in this process, deeming this facility to be something that needed to be looked after. Your thoughts about the repairs and the overall schedule and the timeline that has been presented thus far?
Thanks for the question. I mean, we have to bear in mind that a year ago, or up until a little over a year ago, this was a functioning facility that it's a fuel storage facility, but it's also a fuel distribution facility that you don't have the fuel unless you want to move it in and out. And until the Department of Health issued its order in December of last year, telling the facility it had to stop operations, it was operating. And, the Navy fought tooth and nail against the Department of Health's emergency order and saying, no, we can safely continue operating this facility and it shouldn't have to be defueled. Now, all of a sudden that they need to get the fuel out, there's this long laundry list of repairs that they couldn't possibly do more efficiently than taking a year and a half plus to get them in place. And again, that sort of strains credulity. And then, as far as whether they knew about the need for these repairs before, I'm going to give them that. I think that they were so negligent in operating this facility that I believe them when they say that we really didn't pay attention to all the ways in which the facility was crumbling. So it is crumbling, and we do need to make sure the fuel gets out safely. But I can't imagine that you need to do all of this work to get a pipe into a tank and get it out of that facility. I mean, there's got to be a more efficient way. And if they wanted to get out more quickly, I'm sure they'd figure out a way to do that.
Wayne, your thoughts on the overall timeline and some of these repairs that have been brought up as one of the reasons why it's going to take so long?
Yeah, I mean, as David mentioned, this facility was operating, according to the Navy in January of last year, in a manner that meets or exceeds all regulatory and industry standards. They actually put out a press release to that effect, and which is now conveniently removed from their Navy website. You know, yeah, it's just unacceptable to have to wait, 20 months before just the fuel is removed from this facility, much less the sludge, the cleaning chemicals, all of the other contaminants that may threaten our water supply. If you look at the Joint Task Force's organizational chart, there's really nothing in there that looks at alternative ways to defuel, to expedite the process of making it safe. And I think that's something that's, we really need some federal intervention on, as well as just a recognition that this is an emergency and it requires emergency action and emergency resources.
David, going back to the subject of cameras, the Navy says that in the absence of having cameras up and running in those areas, they will put additional personnel. They say because the function of the camera really is to provide surveillance, so that if there is a spill that is happening, they have eyes on it through the cameras. And since they won't have the cameras there, they will have personnel in place instead. Is that adequate to you? Do you think that that takes the place of cameras?
No, absolutely not. For two reasons. Number one, I'm sure they don't have the personnel stationed there today, 24/7, the way a camera would be. So what they're talking about is having personnel on the ground when they know fuel is moving and they think they know the places where they should be looking for potential leaks. And so certainly in the absence of cameras, we want to have people there, but they should be monitoring that facility around the clock, because as we've seen, this AFFF, this firefighting foam that was spilled, was not during a defueling operation. This was just something that happened, and things keep happening at this facility. And so we need to have those cameras on and operational all the time. The other thing is, with a camera, then there's going to be some video and some documentary evidence that hopefully eventually the people and their elected officials are going to be able to see. And so, that they have some sailor on the ground with eyes on the situation and then reporting back to us. I would rather see the footage myself, because, just in terms of the trust is gone.
Wayne, can you speak a little bit to that, this whole trust issue? The Navy has said repeatedly on this program and elsewhere that they want to be fully transparent, that they are partners with the community, that they themselves use that water source for their own personnel, and so clearly they have a vested interest in protecting it. What's your view up until this point about the trust between the Navy and our community?
One of the things that, there's just so many examples of how their actions have failed to meet their words. One of the things you can look to, like, pretty obviously, is how they've been treating the people they've poisoned. Their own service members' families are still struggling for adequate health care, just for information about what they've been exposed to. They've set up a Red Hill clinic that apparently takes hours and multiple phone calls just to get an appointment, and it's not open to everyone that's been impacted like they said it would be. Just the way they've been treating their folks that they've directly harmed in itself is, I think, an indication of their lack of trustworthiness.
Unfortunately, Hawaii is not the only community that's having to deal with these types of interactions with the military. I'm wondering if you can speak to what you're learning, the conversations that you're having with others who are dealing with a similar situation, maybe not to the degree of this actual contamination of an aquifer, but anything that might be similar. David, we'll start with you. What are you learning from other communities and hearing about their working relationship with the military? Earthjustice
is working closely with communities in Guam that, like Oahu, has a sole source aquifer that provides, the northern aquifer in Guam provides drinking water to about 70% of the island's population. And there are a number of military facilities that are over that aquifer, including an Air Force base in the north. And for decades, the U.S. Air Force has been disposing of its bombs and other munitions and other hazardous waste by literally taking them onto a beach on the bare sand and blowing them up on the beach with no containment at all, And with those contaminants leaching down into the soil, out into the ocean, and people are very concerned about contamination of their sole source aquifer from that. So Earthjustice has been working with the community there to try and hold the Air Force accountable to protect that water supply, which also presumably serves the Air Force and Navy service people who are in Guam. But unfortunately, the military has a lot of difficulty giving up these World War II era practices that in the 21st century we know threaten our environment and our health.
And Wayne, if you can speak to the conversations that you're having with other communities and maybe with the Sierra Club as a whole on a national level, the type of support and resources and just what the organization is trying to do to help communities like ours.
Yeah, unfortunately, as we've been learning throughout this crisis, we're far from the only example of a community that's had its environment contaminated by Department of Defense installations. We actually have a local group, Shimanchu Y Protectors, who are Uchinanchu Okinawans who understand what it's like to have their ancestral homelands contaminated because they're finding forever chemicals now, in folks' blood, in their drinking water, in sacred springs that they use for religious practices. Folks in Sivukak in St. Lawrence Island, that's a former military installation. Their subsistence resources, their waters are highly contaminated. Across the continent, everywhere there's been a military installation now, they're finding, whether it's PCBs or forever chemicals or fuel, their water, their foundations of life, have been contaminated potentially irreversibly. And so the National Sierra Club does have a toxics program. They've been helping us understand what's going on with this AFFF, these forever chemicals. They are, offering support, including water testing, so we can establish baselines. Of course, that will require, access, I think, to some water sources that we might not have access to currently. And they're also working with communities across the continent to help them understand, the threats that they're dealing with.
I'd like to ask you both about what you think is an acceptable sort of end for this facility. David, you referenced this at the top of our program as well. There is an ongoing conversation. Of course, there does seem to be agreement between the Pentagon and your organizations and the state government that this facility does need to be decommissioned as soon as possible. But what should happen long-term to the tanks themselves? Are these conversations about what they're calling closure in place or perhaps repurposing this facility for something else? David, let's start with you and then we'll hear from Wayne about what should happen to the tanks themselves once they are successfully defueled.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think one thing that your viewers need to understand, first of all, about the options. The Navy recently released what they called an independent third-party report by a group called Jacobs on what their options were, which very interestingly completely backed up what the Navy had said a month earlier, that it wanted to do closure in place and leaving open the option for future reuse. What your viewers need to understand is Jacobs is not independent. They may be not the Navy, but they are on a long-term $99 million contract with the Department of Defense. So that they parrot exactly what the Navy just said in their report is not too surprising. There's no independence here. But in terms of the options, I mean, it's very simple. We can't count on the Navy to resist the temptation to reuse this facility that is located only 100 feet over our aquifer and put in it substances that would put us in harm's way again. So whatever option is pursued needs to make sure that this facility can no longer be used for storing anything. This is a lousy place to store anything. And so closure in place, holding open the door to some future reuse is totally unacceptable. And even if this administration, this presidential administration, is committed to closure, we don't know what the next administration is going to think about that, or the one after that. And we here on Oahu, we cannot abide by potentially hazardous materials placed right over our aquifer. So this was, an understandable solution 80 years ago. It's a lousy way to store things in the 21st century. And so whatever they do, they need to put enough material in there to make it unusable in the future.
And Wayne, what are your thoughts as to what should ultimately happen to those tanks?
I'll have to echo and add on to what David just said. I mean, from a practical perspective, like these tanks are not usable. I mean, they're 80 years old. They're actively corroding. There's water that passes through soil and picks up acidic things, and that percolates down into the facility. It's been doing that for 80 years. There's hundreds of welds that have been made over the decades have been found defective. We just can't possibly use these tanks for anything reliable. I mean, they're and that's a concern that I have about the defueling timeline, is that it's not safe to keep fueling these tanks as much as Navy tries to argue for their integrity. And so anything that happens, we have to think about what we would think acceptable to have happen to our water, and think of the timelines of not just next few decades, but like over the next century or so. Otherwise, we're just saddling our grandchildren with another Red Hill crisis.
We are just a few minutes away from the end of the show, but I did want to allow you guys to have a final thought. But also, this has sparked a lot of obviously interest by community members who feel helpless at times. They recognize the importance of this issue, and many want to do something. They just don't know how to help. You both work with organizations that are connected to other groups that have actively advocated against what's happening at Red Hill. So in your final thoughts, Wayne and David, Wayne, we'll actually start with you. How can people get involved? What are ways in which people who have a voice and really want to do something, what would you encourage them to do in this situation?
So there are a number of groups that folks can follow. On social media. That's how we have been able to get information out relatively quickly, including about actions that folks can take. So following Oahu Water Protectors, which is one of the leaders of the grassroots Shutdown Red Hill campaign. Of course, you can follow Sierra Club Hawaii or Sierra Club HI. But one of the, I think most important things that people can do is to talk to each other and reach out. If you have a group, a church or a club that wants to learn more, and more than happy to provide presentations, provide information, answer questions. We need as many people to understand what's going on as possible, because it's going to continue to be a fight for the next year.
And David, I'll give you the final word. Your thoughts on how people get involved, and just your final message here this morning.
Yeah, well, how people can get involved is to continue to remind their elected officials every day that this is an issue that their own health, their children's health, all of our health depends on. And I really got to give appreciation to our congressional delegation that's done a wonderful job of raising this issue up. This is not a situation where we have to be pinching pennies. There is adequate funding there. Our congressional delegation has managed to secure $2.2 billion to address the environmental and health disaster the Navy has created. And we just need to keep this on the front burner and make sure that our state government, our federal government understands that job number one is to keep all of us safe, keep our kids safe. And the only way we're going to do that is to get the fuel out of the ground. And so let's not be having the same conversation this time next year. Let's not give the Navy another year of opportunities to further poison our water supply. Let's get safe, and let's do it as quickly as we possibly can.
David Henkin and Wayne Tanaka, thank you both for being here on this last day of 2022. We really appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy New Year.
Ryan, at times I find that conversation chilling to think about just how much fuel is still above the aquifer, and, the ongoing conversation and real conflict between the Navy and our community and our elected officials. We all say we want to get to the same place, which is defueling this facility, but how we get there obviously is in conflict at the moment. And it was interesting, especially to hear about the fire suppressant spill. I did not know myself that that area has now been paved over, and what that could mean for future surveillance of that land. That is something that I would like to hear the Navy explain their rationale for and hear more about. That was news to me. But overall, you hear a lot of frustration, especially, Ryan, on the issue of these cameras.
Yeah, that was one of the pushbacks that we heard, is just the overall transparency that the Navy is claiming to have, but really not providing much evidence of some of the things that are requesting, including that soil sample report of this latest incident with these fire suppressants. The impact that was that was done, and the impact study that was done, is still information that has not been released, and information about the cameras. We also heard some pushback there, especially from David, talking about the argument that the Navy's presenting of national security and the integrity of the investigation, and that is why we have not been able to receive some of the footage that they are holding on to of this latest incident, and some pushback saying that there really isn't a military or strategic component that is attached to this spill, and that footage should be released. And we also just, again, heard a lot of pushback from the overall handling of this, and their thoughts about moving forward and what should be done with this facility.
Yeah, I expect to be a lot of conversation about what should happen to the tanks themselves. There is agreement, of course, on what should happen to the fuel. There are a lot of questions on what should happen to the facility. We will stay on this issue. We, of course, will invite the Navy back to answer more questions, more of your questions, along with state and local leaders and the congressional delegation. They have been, as they noted there, very successful in securing funding for this. But it doesn't seem that money is really accelerating the timeline, and that is something that we all want to see push forward. So we will continue to stay on this. And very interesting, Ryan, the last day of 2022, looking forward to great shows in the next year. But wow, what a year on Spotlight Hawaii we have had.
Yeah, it really has been a great time to connect our viewers. We want to, first of all, thank those loyal viewers who tune in every single day, asking those questions. We try our best to incorporate your questions and your comments into the conversation. We'll continue to do more of that in the new year. And there have been some pretty memorable moments. I got to ask you, Yenji, as we close out, is there any specific show or any conversation that we've had over the year that stands out to you the most?
Well, I always love having Mayor Rick Blanchiardi on this program. We cover such a wide range of topics. He always says he wants to do a full hour, but we never seem to be able to book that. But we always cover a lot of news with him, and he is someone who is very candid and breaks a lot of news. And of course, we had so many political debates and conversations. Those were also very memorable. Ryan, what about you?
Yeah, I think the first Democratic forum that we had with the three candidates that were vying for the Democratic nomination, that was their first time kind of all being together, and we really saw the sparks fly. And it was funny because after our conversation with these candidates, they kind of took a different tone in the other debates that were held. So interesting to see how the conversation was in our show and what happened moving forward. But it has been a crazy year for Hawaii, with so many things happening, but we always appreciate you, the viewers, for being involved and being a part of the conversation. We look forward to an exciting 2023. Can't believe we're saying that.
We'll see you next year.
Yeah, we'll see you next year. Stay safe and aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.